What is up, guys? Adam here. So today I'll be adding a ton of power to my 2004 KDX 220R, and I'm doing this to get it ready for the enduro and trail riding season here in Washington. So I already have the bike all torn down and ready to go, but before we get into that, I want to tell you guys a little bit of a backstory on the KDX 220 because I'm guessing a lot of you guys maybe haven't heard of that bike before. So the KDX 220R was made between 1983 and 2006 and was made as a small enduro bike, and it really dominated enduro races in a tight, they call it East Coast Enduro. It was really tight enduro racing. This kind of riding translated perfectly to the single track riding that I would do growing up. So the domination this bike used to have in that setting is really what attracted me to getting one of these. Alright guys, I'm going to get to work. I'm super excited to show you guys how much power this bike has at the end of this video. You can get a ton of power out of these things by doing just a few modifications to them. Alright, so here's what the bike's starting as. I have it torn down because I had some of the engine components sent off to get worked on. But we're going to give this bike a little bit of a cleanup and get to work on rebuilding the top end of this engine. So we're going to start here with the piston. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and pull out the circlip here with a little pick. This circlip is basically what holds the wrist pin into the piston and in turn attaches the piston to the crankshaft. Alright, now that we have the circlip out, we can go ahead and pull the wrist pin through. Usually you do not need a special tool to do this. In this case, the wrist pin is a little bit stuck in there, so I have a special tool from Motion Pro called a piston pin puller. And basically you'll put a little collet on one side and then just thread the rod through and it pulls the wrist pin out of the piston. I prefer to use this kind of setup over hammering the wrist pin out and potentially damaging the crankshaft. And now that we can pull the piston off here, we'll take a look at it, and you can see it has a lot of carbon buildup on it, so definitely a good time to replace it. Also, if you look here, you can see it has a pretty good crack in it, so these KDX pistons are pretty common to fail, so it's definitely a good time to get this one out and put a new one in. And now that we have our piston out, I don't want to forget to remove our old wrist pin bearing out of here. You'll definitely want to replace this. And I'll also check the crankshaft before I put the new piston in. So I'll put it at top dead center and then wiggle up and down. And if there's any up and down play, that's a bad sign for the bearing. If you guys do have some side to side movement, that is okay though. It's just the up and down that's going to give you problems. And in this case, my crankshaft seemed to be healthy, so I'm ready to install a new Wiseco piston. Wiseco is definitely a quality piston brand and they make good stuff. In this case, it didn't come with a new wrist pin bearing, which usually these piston kits will, so I'll have to figure out why that is and get a new one ordered up. And while I'm waiting on that wrist pin to come in, I'm going to do some more work tonight, so I'm going to clean out this air box as well as replace the air filter because I definitely want this engine to be breathing clean air since I'm putting a good amount of money into it. This bike definitely needs a new front tire, so we're going to throw one of those on tonight as well. And while I have the cylinder and carburetor off the engine, it's probably a good time to just clean up some of the dirt off this bottom end with a degreaser and a brush. Alright, we finally got the wrist pin in the mail, so we're ready to go on this top end. We'll just put some assembly lube into the small end of the crankshaft and then work our wrist pin around in there and make sure it's properly lubricated for the initial startup. Alright, now I can go ahead and install the wrist pin into the piston here. So it's easy to just stick one end in and then kind of wedge your thumb over it and push it in there and kind of hold on it. And after you get a good hold on it with your thumb, you can go ahead and take a flat blade screwdriver and wedge it in there the rest of the way. Just be careful not to scratch the outer edge of the piston. In this case, I'll just have to push the last little bit in with my finger. So on this style of piston, your ring groove's really deep, so the ring tends to slide past your little spot there for it to sit on. So I'm just going to push the wrist pin through. See if I can't push that ring into where it's supposed to go. There we go. Now here's another spot where you could mess up. You see it's all the way seated in there except up here. So you can see it didn't seat all the way up here, so all we'll do is just push it into the groove. Alright, now that we got our first circlip on, we can just look at the top of the piston and check where the arrow is, and that arrow is going to point towards the exhaust side of the engine. Now I can just rest the piston on the top of the crankshaft here and then go ahead and lube up the wrist pin. You want to make sure this has a good amount of assembly lube for that initial startup. Now I'll just push in the wrist pin and then install the circlip on this side of the engine. Alright, now we can go ahead and install our Wiseco piston rings. In this case, it doesn't matter which side is facing up or which piston ring is on the top or bottom, but this usually does matter, so you'll want to make sure you do check that. And then when I install piston rings, I like to lube up the top of the piston with some assembly lube just to make sure those rings slide into the grooves nice and easy. You'll just kind of want to spread them out around the piston. Don't be too forceful with them, but they can take a little bit of maneuvering. And before I install the cylinder onto the piston here, I like to put some 2-stroke oil on the piston skirts. I do use this instead of assembly lube because assembly lube causes glazing in the cylinder and won't allow your rings to seat all the way when you're starting up the bike, and it can also cause a loss in compression. Alright, and I sent this cylinder out to Jeff at Fredette Racing to get ported. He used to race these bikes back in the 90s and won a lot of Enduro races with them, so he definitely knows how to get power out of these things. So I'm excited to get this cylinder on here and see what it can do. And if you look at the bottom of the cylinder here, you'll see the intake ports where they suck in the fuel and air, and you can see he really opened these up with a porting tool. And also if you go over here, he leaves a rough textured finish on there. This helps with fuel dissipation. And then on the exhaust side, when you're porting, you want to make sure you have a smooth finish. And he also went in and cleaned out the power valves here, so those should be all good and ready to go. Alright, now I'll go ahead and install the cylinder base gasket. And then I can go ahead and work the cylinder on over the piston rings. Just want to make sure your piston rings stay in their grooves. And after you guys have your cylinder base nuts tightened down, you can do the best part of the whole operation, and that is testing out the engine. And if any of you guys have a KDX 220, you just want to be careful when you're installing the power valve arm onto the top end. That nut is left-hand thread, and then it's a plastic rod, so you want to hold it as you tighten it down. And well, Fredette had the top end of my engine. He also had the carburetor, so he took this carb and he bored it out way over stock. It's just going to let more fuel and air into the engine. And the last thing I had done while the engine was at Fredette Racing is have him mill down the cylinder head. This will just raise compression in the engine and give it a little bit more power on the bottom end. So basically what this means is he took the outer edge and milled it down a little bit, and this brings the dome closer to the piston as it's going up and down in the cylinder. It'll compress the fuel and air tighter against that dome, and upon combustion release more energy. And when I was looking in the service manual to tighten down the cylinder head, it just wants you to do it in a cross pattern. It doesn't specify anything about hitting it with a lighter torque and then a heavier torque, but I'll still probably hit it with 10 foot-pounds and then go back in and hit it with 20. And it's always a good idea to put new seals on your expansion chamber, and if you guys watch the CR125 build, you know I like to put a little bit of RTV on there as well. Alright, well that's everything we're going to do in this video. You can see it looks a lot cleaner than it did at the start. Obviously it's not going to come out as cool as the 125 since we just did a little bit of work on it today, but did a lot of good stuff to add some power, so I'm just excited to get this thing running. But before I do that, I'm just going to show you guys a few little things I still need to clean up later on. Alright, so if you look up here at the gas cap, you can see it has a pretty good sized crack in it, so I'll definitely have to replace the gas cap. And then obviously these grips are really worn out, so I'll be tossing on a new pair of lock-on grips. And I already added some fuel into the gas tank, and I was getting a pretty good leak out of this drain hose here, so that's why I have it tucked up right now. But that's probably caused by the needle valve sticking in the carburetor, so I'll need to get a rebuild kit and get that fixed at some point. So yeah, other than those few little pieces there, we are pretty much all good to go for this season. Next season I have some pretty big plans for this bike. I'm going to be doing a frame swap on it and add a bunch of off-road goodies to it, so I'm excited for that one. But the main reason I tore down the bike in the first place is because I wanted to add some power to it. It was a little bit, it has good power, a lot of bottom end, but it just wasn't on the same level as a lot of the KTMs, the KTM 300s. That's really what put this bike out of business. With those bikes, that's why Kawasaki stopped making these. So I just wanted to add some good power to it to be able to keep up with the newer KTMs. I just got this bike all broken in. I didn't show that on camera just because I was just putting around on it for a bit, getting everything warmed up. But now the bike's all warmed up, ready to go. So I'm gonna get it started and really test it out and see if it's got the power it needs to have to keep up with those KTMs. Alright guys, well that was a ton of fun. The bike definitely has a lot more power, huge power gains on it. I'll definitely need to get back in riding shape to be able to ride this thing to its full capacity, but it is going to be a ton of fun this summer. Alright guys, well I appreciate you watching. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, and I have some really cool mods coming on the CR125, so stay tuned for those.